Part 1. Good Will Hunting. I'm a producer for Alone, the TV show on history. This story is about a participant we had in Season 2, whose footage we had to cut. I've never felt comfortable talking about this before, especially because it opens me up for liability. After all, giving away TV show secrets is a bit of a faux pas, especially a survival show. But I feel like people should know the truth. One of the things you may not know about the show is we often have nearly double the number of participants actually part of the show, and in editing we choose the most entertaining people and only include them in the actual season. That way we can weed out the boring people, super survivors who could literally last years alone, who we have to force tap or otherwise make them quit, and also get rid of the ones who can't even handle a single night alone in nature. That happens a surprising amount. But these people don't make for entertaining TV. Season 2 took place on Vancouver Island, a densely forested land with just as much fish as it has rain. The weather, the chill, the numbing wind took care of most of our contestants. And if you watched the season, you'd know the winner, Dave, lasted 66 days. Long, but as I said, there were other super survivors who lasted longer. We let them stay out longer as an experiment to see just how long it might take. These men, all the women had tapped by then, had built impressively sized cabins from the surrounding forests. All except Will, that was his name. When Will sent us his application and video, he seemed like a normal guy. Well, for a survivalist. He was the kind of guy who came off as a good guy to know both at the local bar and should the apocalypse hit. The kind of survivalist who hunts for sport but could really stay out there for some time. He had professional training, would take others on managed hunts, and spent a lot of time in nature preserves camping by himself. Really personable and had the looks for the show too. We knew he'd be popular, but the image wouldn't last. When we picked up the footage on day 90 and reviewed it, we found a very different person. Describing his story isn't exactly easy. See, one thing about the show is these guys are really alone. Like really alone. We drop them off, give them their chosen 10 items of survival gear, knife, axe, tarp, fishing line, stuff like that. They get to choose the 10 items themselves, video equipment, and say good luck. Oh, and there's the emergency satellite phone they use for when they finally tap. It also allows us to track their movements. Usually, at least. Of course, out in the wild, with tall, dense forests and the typical cloud cover of Vancouver Island, connections can be tricky. We leave them be until they hit the button to come home, except in the cases of super survivors. And for Will, days 1 to 38 were normal for Will. Compared to the others, he struggled no more, no less. Typical footage of failed fishing, some successful drop falls, a way to catch small rodents. But he wasn't desperate enough yet to eat insects. From the looks of it, he was doing well. No real mental struggle. Not even a single night scare, which is what we call the footage participants take when they're awakened by a rummaging animal, usually a mouse or other small rodent, but sometimes a wild hog or bear gets nosy. He'd talk about missing his family, his parents and brothers and sister, but every participant does that. But something happened on day 58 that seemed to change Will. We know something happened on day 58 because when Will reappeared on footage on day 59, he was a markedly different person. After not having taped anything since day 39, the footage seemed to come at daybreak, with Will's face covered in blood. We figure it must have been deer blood, as he had been tracking a small group of deer that seemed to live maybe a quarter to a half mile away. He hadn't been too concerned about the local bears. They're big and dangerous, but he had only seen one in his entire time there, and wasn't planning on hunting any, and the other game was too small to be worth the energy. He was stringing up his kill. Too blurry to make out the animal, but, as I said, we're pretty sure it was a deer. He hadn't cooked it yet, and we couldn't see if he had started a fire. It was just him across the camp, tying the animal up to a tree so he could gut it. The video seemed to come on and off without any movement from him at all. None of the pushing the button on the camera, that you would typically see when starting or ending a shot. It just stopped. The video lasted 49 seconds. The participants are supposed to tape every day, and preferably as much as possible, so that we can splice together a ton of shots. Nature shots, instructional shots to show how they created their cabins, weapons, or the trinkets like necklaces that some of them enjoy making to pass the time. The next video from Will came on day 70. Will didn't look like Will. Up until day 58, he had kept a pretty clean-shaven face. He wasn't a big fan of beards, and took care to use his survival knife to cut as close as possible to keep that quarterback turn model image we saw in that application video. But now he looked old, dirty, dried blood flaking from his face. Newer blood than day 58, but old enough to where it shouldn't be there hours or days after hunting and eating the kill. It was just different. He spoke, though. He apologized for not taking video as much as he should have. Said hunting was a little more difficult lately, and he felt like he was losing weight too fast. That he would dream of steak and of prior hunts and of family and of Thanksgiving dinner. He thought about tapping but said it was too late for that. The video ended. As he had promised, the video started back up on day 76. This time he was ranting, yelling at the forest. He talked about his food rotting too quickly despite the freezing temperatures, not being able to find any others to eat, and starving. This was far past frustration we typically see from participants. This was anger, deep-seated anger. The footage ended abruptly after he threw his hatchet at the camera. He didn't tape again until day 82. But this wasn't normal footage. Not even like before. The video came on and it's just him standing there. Silent. Still. Not in his tent. In the middle of camp, though the video was zoomed in closely on his face. No blood anymore and no movement from him either. Not to turn on the camera. Not to make sure the shot was in focus. Just standing. This continued for 3 days. We thought the video must have inadvertently paused. But I am not joking. We even checked the GPS records on the emergency phone. For 3 days Will stood in his camp without movement. Trees around him shaking in the wind. Rain and snow falling from the sky. Will remained still and looking off into the distance until the video shut off in the afternoon of day 85. The battery and video card on the camera should have run out 2.5 days prior, but they didn't. Captured it all. We never did see or even hear any animals in the footage for those 3 days, though, which was weird. To be honest, we aren't sure what happened to Will. You see, we arrived at his camp on day 90, and Will wasn't there. That's not all that uncommon. Sometimes we get there and they're off hunting. We checked the GPS for the phone, but it was nowhere to be found. We waited in camp all day until it started getting dark. We had already loaded Will's belongings, including the camera equipment, into the boat. A couple of guys stayed behind in a tent to see when he'd show up. He never did. About 3 miles away down the coast, another suspected super survivor, Benjamin, had made camp. In his last scene, he's fishing along the coast, stick as a rod in hand, and line in the water. He looks up from the river towards the camera, white-faced and wide-eyed, and the video abruptly stops. It was day 58. We never found him either. Part 2. Voices. You'd think that having been a producer for History's Alone TV show since the beginning, you'd just about seen everything by now, but sometimes things happen that surprise you, things that you just can't find an explanation for. Dennett was your prototypical Alone contestant, a somewhat gruff but good-looking guy who grew up hunting and fishing, and ran his own naturalist survival outfit in the backwoods of Maine. He taught people how to survive in the woods for days, weeks, or even months, but did it in even more of a naturalist way, or at least that's what he claimed. Instead of bringing manufactured tools along, he insisted on bringing only tools he made while out in the wild. But what made Dennett really different from most contestants were the voices. It's not that he claimed he could hear voices. It's that we could. Dennett would take hours of video footage as he's required to, except that there seemed to be other voices in addition to his, almost like an echo. At first, we figured he might have been trying to cheat, and he had brought other teammates along with him. It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened. We've had more than a few cases of contestants trying to get an advantage by doing anything between hiding supplies in the forest and tending to them off camera, to actually getting supplies airdropped to them from a small plane they arranged before taping. So I wasn't surprised we were seeing something new here, with a guy somehow arranging for friends or teammates to join him, and then just keep them off camera. Except there were no friends or others around him. After we heard the voices and suspected he was cheating, the next time we went in for a medical visit, we also put up a camera around his camp, unbeknownst to him, and streamed the footage into our camp, but there was no one to be found. At this point, we figure there must have been a problem with the equipment we gave Dennett. So we switched all of the gear out. Everything. All the cameras, memory cards, even the tripods. Everything. Except the voices didn't go away. Instead, when we reviewed the footage after each visit, the voices seemed to get louder and louder, though we still couldn't make out what they were saying or what the source was. All we could do was review the tape and try to remove the ambient voices, as we started calling them. But things got more complicated as the voices became louder. The voices, it seemed, were coming from Dennett, where before the voices were low enough that we thought maybe even we were a bit crazy for even thinking they were voices. Now it was clear. As Dennett would speak to the camera, the other voices were talking at the same time, but were not exactly intelligible, at least not at first. We figured maybe there's a chance this guy is just duping us with some kind of ventriloquist-like act, looking for his 15 minutes of fame. Or maybe he was legitimately crazy and was having some type of psychological event. Watching the tape became more and more distracting, so much so that we started simply writing him off as a participant. We'd still do medical checks, including a new mental health check that he passed each time, but we wouldn't dedicate as much time to editing his footage as we would some other contestants. But it was hard not to watch. Admittedly, some guys would laugh at the footage, but I was more sympathetic. This man was seemingly having some type of odd psychological breakdown or some appearance of schizophrenia or something, but was somehow passing every mental health check we gave him. We had no idea what was going on, but the laughing soon stopped. Dennett's voices became clearer, while he was otherwise doing a self-interview, explaining how hungry he was after not having had any luck with fishing the past few days. The voices were saying far more disturbing things. "We need help," it said in a loud, pleading voice. "Please help us." Another voice simultaneously exclaimed, "Get him out of here. Make him leave." Except what was heard was different for everyone who watched the tape. I might hear Dennett and one voice, and other person heard Dennett and another voice. No one seemed to hear exactly the same thing. Just different voices or slight variations or different things entirely. We visited Dennett that night and tried our best to explain some of what was happening. He wasn't really having it. "You're just trying to get me to lose," he said. "If I tap out, then you can give it to someone who you like more." He wouldn't watch the footage. He outright refused and was getting angrier by the minute. The tone in his voice changed. "Fuck you if you think you can make us go. Come back with this bullshit again and you'll see what we can do." We left him for the night. After reviewing the footage of the interview and hearing more of the voices pleading for help, some with impenetrable screams, some of the crew left the production camp, refusing to work any further. We didn't know what we were dealing with, but we felt like we were in danger. We also felt like he was in danger, but we didn't know how to deal with that either. At the request of the remaining crew, we flew in a local pastor, but even he didn't last through one viewing of the latest tape. He demanded to get out now, especially after his Bible suddenly and mysteriously turned damp and black, so much so that it was as if an entire jug of ink had exploded in his backpack, but got on nothing else. We had to copter him back to civilization that same day. We decided at that moment that we would reduce our checks on Dennett, and all checks would have at least 10 crew members present. For insurance purposes, we'd keep asking him for footage, but we knew he wouldn't appear in the actual show, and we would figure out how to manufacture his exit later. It never reached that moment. On our next visit, we showed up to an empty camp. No shelter, no fire, no remnants of food or someone having lived there at all. The only thing left being the camera gear strewn about the forest floor. A simple note hung from the tree that used to hold up his structure. Going now. Watch and you will follow. The middle of his camp, where his campfire had been, was now nothing but a hole in the ground that was so deep you couldn't see the bottom. We agreed we wouldn't watch the video, and our camera operator melted the card using his lighter and then threw the card down the hole. As we walked back toward our boat, we heard a distant scream coming from his camp, and the water around our boat turned black as ink. On that day, we made a pact never to return. Years later, I heard a rumor that the cameraman had actually burned and threw an empty card down the hole, keeping the one Dennett left. When I went to ask him if the rumor was true, it turned out he had disappeared some months prior, much the same way as Dennett had. He went out camping alone, never to be heard from again. If you want to watch part 3, you'll find the playlist link in the description. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.